She stood in the most expensive bridal boutique in the city, fingers trembling as she tried to pull the zipper up on a white dress that refused to close. Not because she was broken, not because she was less, but because the woman standing beside her, the one who shared her blood, was laughing. That laughter would cost both of them everything. And the man watching from the doorway, the man nobody noticed, saw something in that moment that would change the rest of his life. If you want to know what happens next, stay until the end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The zipper stopped at the small of her back like it had made a decision. Mara Ellsworth felt it before she heard anything. That particular stillness in a room when people are deciding whether to look away or lean in. The kind of stillness that has teeth. She was standing in the center of Celestine Bridal, one of those boutiques where the carpet costs more per square foot than most people's rent, where the lighting is designed to make every woman feel like she belongs in a magazine. Except Mara didn't feel that way. Mara never felt that way. She felt the zipper's refusal like a verdict. "Oh, Mara." Celine's voice carried across the room the way it always did. Effortless, melodic, shaped by 29 years of being the beautiful one. She was holding a glass of complimentary champagne, tilting her head just slightly, the way a person does when they're performing sympathy but haven't actually felt it in years. Honey. That one word, that single syllable. Mara's jaw tightened. She caught her own reflection in the floor-length mirror in front of her. 3 versions of herself staring back from 3 different angles, none of them looking the way she'd hoped. The dress was ivory silk with a cathedral neckline, and on the hanger it had looked like something a woman with confidence would wear. On Mara, with the zipper frozen halfway up, it looked like evidence. "I think it just needs a different size," the sales associate said carefully. Young woman, mid-20s, the practiced smile of someone trained to manage difficult situations. Her name tag read Corinne. Corinne had been wonderful up until this moment. Now Corinne looked like she wanted to disappear into the silk-covered walls. "She's been saying that her whole life," Celine said, and laughed. Light, musical, the laugh of a woman who has never once worried about a zipper. 2 of Celine's friends, women Mara had met maybe 4 times total, women whose names she could never quite keep straight, laughed along. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just automatically, the way people laugh when a beautiful woman sets the tone. Mara turned away from the mirror. She didn't cry. That was the thing people never understood about her. She had trained herself not to cry in public so thoroughly that the reflex was almost surgical. Instead, she felt something go quiet inside her chest, like a door closing in an empty house. She reached behind her back, found the zipper pull with her fingernails, and tugged it back down with a soft metallic sound. "I'm going to try the other one," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that, in the hollow way she was usually proud of things. "The champagne's getting warm," Celine called after her. Mara walked toward the fitting room corridor without looking back. The carpet absorbed her footsteps. Behind her, conversation resumed. Corks were referenced. Some story about Celine's honeymoon itinerary spilled into the room like warm light. Mara pushed through the velvet curtain and stood alone in a fitting room the size of her bathroom. The ivory dress pooled around her waist, and she pressed her back against the wall and breathed. In, out, count it. She had learned that from a therapist she'd seen briefly at 23, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who had kind eyes and a direct manner, and who had told Mara in their 4th session that her primary coping mechanism was shrinking, making herself smaller to prevent conflict, apologizing preemptively, laughing at herself before others could. "It's a survival strategy," Dr. Okafor had said. "It worked when you were a child. It's destroying you as an adult." Mara had stopped going after session 7. She hadn't been ready to hear it. Now, at 28, standing alone in a fitting room while her sister's laughter filtered through the velvet curtain, she thought maybe she still wasn't ready. But being ready had never seemed to matter much. The world kept moving regardless. She hung the dress on the hook and stood in her underwear under the boutique's warm lighting, and she made herself look. Not flinching, not turning sideways instinctively the way she usually did. Just looking. Her body was soft in places she had spent 2 decades at war with. Her shoulders curved inward slightly, a habit so old it felt structural. There was a small scar on her left hip from a childhood accident she barely remembered. Her hands, she noticed, were still shaking slightly. She stopped looking. She pulled her own clothes back on, dark jeans, a pale blue blouse she had bought because it was loose enough to hide things. And she smoothed her hair and rearranged her face into the expression she'd been perfecting since she was 11 years old. Calm, fine, unbothered. The smile that said everything is okay, even when the room is on fire. She pushed the curtain aside and walked back out. She didn't see him at first. Adrian Kestrel was standing near the entrance of Celestine Bridal, which was strange because men didn't typically wait inside bridal boutiques. They waited outside, in the cars, checking their phones. But he wasn't waiting in the way of a man who has been dragged somewhere. He was standing with the particular stillness of a person who sees something and cannot immediately explain why it holds their attention. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone would notice about Adrian Kestrel. Not his net worth or his name or the way his suits were cut. Just the physical fact of him taking up space differently than most people did. 34 years old, dark hair cut close on the sides, a jaw that looked like it had been through arguments and won. He was wearing charcoal gray, no tie, collar open one button, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. He was watching Mara, not the way men sometimes watched women in public, with that particular brand of lazy assessment, top to bottom, the mental arithmetic of conventional attractiveness. He was watching the way she walked back into the room, the way she had her shoulders set, precise and deliberate, like someone bracing for impact they were pretending not to expect, the way the smile arrived a half second after the curtain moved. Practiced, installed, not quite reaching her eyes. He saw it the way you see a crack in a wall that someone has painted over. The paint is perfect. The crack is still there. Mara collected her bag from the chair near the window and said something pleasant to Corinne. Thanked her probably, because Mara would absolutely thank the sales associate in this situation, would make a point of it. And then Celine was beside her again, arm looping through hers, some new comment falling out of her mouth like it cost nothing. "We'll find you something with more room through the middle," Celine said. "There are designers who specifically work with fuller figures. I actually know a woman." "I need some air," Mara said. Just that. Just those 4 words, quiet and flat, and she slipped her arm free of Celine's and walked toward the door. She passed within 6 feet of Adrian Kestrel without looking at him. But he looked at her. And for a reason he would not be able to explain for a very long time, he remembered her face. The charity gala 4 days later was called the Halcyon Foundation Benefit, which was the kind of name that told you everything about who funded it and nothing about who it was supposed to help. Mara was there because her employer, a mid-sized nonprofit working in educational equity, had been given 2 complimentary tickets as a gesture of goodwill from one of the Halcyon board members. Her boss, a well-meaning man named Gerald, who talked too much about golf, had given 1 ticket to Mara because his wife had a conflicting engagement and someone needed to represent the organization. She had not wanted to come. She was standing near the edge of the main ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water she had not touched, wearing a green dress she had bought 3 years ago for another event she hadn't wanted to attend. The ballroom was spectacular in the way that only money can manufacture. Lanterns strung overhead, casting everything in amber and gold, round tables draped in white linen, people moving through the space in that particular choreography of the very wealthy pretending to be casual. Mara had been to events like this before. She knew the drill. Smile, make small talk, don't eat too much from the past hors d'oeuvres. Find a corner that looks like a choice rather than a retreat. Hold the glass to give your hands something to do. She was good at this. She was good at being invisible in plain sight. "You're the first person I've seen tonight who looks like they actually wish they were somewhere else." She turned. Adrian Kestrel was standing a few feet away, also holding a glass he had not touched, also positioned at the room's periphery. Up close, he was more human than he had appeared in the boutique. There was something slightly tired around his eyes, the quality of a man who has been performing all evening and just ran out of material. Mara looked at him for a moment. That's either a terrible opening line or a very accurate observation. "Both," he said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised her. Adrian. Mara. He didn't offer his last name. She noticed that. "How'd you get dragged to this one?" she asked, because she had learned, in the way that quiet people often do, that asking questions was the best defense against having to answer them. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, subtle. "Family obligation," he said. You? I lost a coin flip with my boss. That made him actually smile. Not the polished, appropriate smile of a man at a gala, but something smaller and more genuine. The kind of smile that happens before you can stop it. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me tonight, he said. The bar seems low. It's underground. Mara laughed before she meant to. They stood there for a moment in the amber-lit noise of the room, and something settled between them that was difficult to name. Not attraction exactly, or not only that, but the particular relief of finding, in a crowded room, a person who seems to be operating at the same frequency. Like turning on the radio in a strange city and accidentally finding a song you know. What do you do? He asked. Educational nonprofit, equity work mostly, making sure kids in under-resourced schools have access to the same materials as everyone else. She paused, waiting for the polite glaze to arrive over his eyes the way it usually did when she described her work at events like this. You? Real estate, he said. Vague answer. He glanced at her sideways. Development, commercial and residential. My family's company. She looked at him steadily. She had started to recognize something, the quality of a person who is used to being known by their name before they arrive, used to the room tilting toward them before they've spoken, and who has become quietly exhausted by it. She recognized it because it was the inverse of her own exhaustion. She was tired of being unseen. He was tired of being seen wrong. Do you hate these things? She asked. Yes, he said, without hesitation. Why do you keep coming? He was quiet for a moment. The lantern swayed slightly in some current of air from the ventilation system. Somewhere across the room, a small jazz ensemble was playing something understated and sad. Because not coming requires an explanation, he said finally. And explanations with my family require more energy than just showing up. Mara understood that in a way that went through her like a current. She didn't say so. She just nodded, and he saw that she understood, and that was enough. They talked for 2 hours, not networked, not performed, talked, the real kind, where you lose track of time and forget to monitor yourself and suddenly say something true before you've decided whether it's safe to. She told him about the work, the real work, the frustrating, beautiful, grinding work of trying to move systems that don't want to move. He talked about buildings, not deals, not square footage, but the actual architecture, the way a building can make people feel something without their knowing why. The way he had once stood inside a half-finished structure in the city's east side and thought for one clear moment that this was the thing he actually cared about before someone handed him a spreadsheet and he went back to caring about returns. When the event ended and they moved toward the exit with the rest of the crowd, she realized she had not once checked the time. He paused at the top of the steps outside. The city was wet from rain that had come and gone while they were inside, the streets reflecting the glow of streetlights in long orange ribbons. I'd like to have coffee sometime, he said, if that's something you'd want. It was direct without being presumptuous. She noticed that too. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had just met, who had talked to her for 2 hours at a party without once looking over her shoulder at someone more important, who had laughed genuinely and listened in the way that suggested he was actually processing what she said instead of waiting for his turn to speak. I might want that, she said carefully. He nodded. They exchanged numbers in the pragmatic way of adults who have stopped performing casualness about these things. Then they went separate ways into the wet night, and Mara walked 2 blocks to her car and sat in the driver's seat for a minute before starting the engine. She felt, underneath the familiar architecture of her caution, something small and dangerous. Hope. Stupid, inconvenient hope. She started the car and drove home and told herself not to make anything of it. The coffee was on a Tuesday, at a small place in the neighborhood between their offices that neither of them had suggested for any particular reason, except that it was halfway between 2 places, and neither of them seemed to care about the coffee anyway. Mara arrived 4 minutes early and ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table and spent those 4 minutes deciding whether the fact that she'd changed her outfit twice that morning was embarrassing or just human. Adrian arrived exactly on time, which she later realized was characteristic. Not early in the way of anxious people, not late in the way of careless ones. He sat down across from her, and they immediately continued a conversation that had apparently been running in both their heads since the gala, picking it up mid-thought. This was how it started. Not with drama. Not with grand gestures, with two people who were both starving for the same thing, genuine, uncomplicated human contact, finding each other in an ordinary coffee shop on a gray Tuesday morning. Over the weeks that followed, the rhythm established itself naturally. Tuesday mornings when their schedules allowed. Thursday evenings sometimes. Walking through the park near Mara's office, a route they developed without discussing it. Past the fountain that always seemed to be either running or broken. Past the bench with the broken armrest. Past the corner where a woman sold handmade jewelry from a folding table and always said hello. Mara stopped monitoring herself quite so carefully. Not all at once. It wasn't like that. It wasn't a single moment of release. It was gradual, like the way your shoulders drop when you've been holding tension so long you forgot you were doing it. She started saying what she actually thought instead of what would cause the least friction. She disagreed with him once about urban development and the displacement of working-class neighborhoods, and instead of softening it into something less confrontational, she just said it directly, said it clearly, and waited. He pushed back. Not defensively, thoughtfully, with the specific energy of someone who finds disagreement more interesting than agreement. They argued for 45 minutes on that bench by the broken fountain, and she walked home afterward feeling more alive than she had in months. He told her things, not the polished narrative of a successful man, but the underneath of it. The father who had handed him a business plan at 13 and called it opportunity, who had stood in the back of every school play and every lacrosse game with the expression of a man waiting for a meeting to end, who had told him once, when Adrian was 17 and had cried after a loss and tried to hide it, that men who led with their feelings were men who got led by their weakness. "I don't know when I stopped feeling things," Adrian said on one of those Thursday walks. "I just know that at some point I looked around and realized I'd traded everything that was mine for everything that was expected." Mara was quiet for a moment. The fountain was running that day. Someone's dog barked twice in the middle distance and then went quiet. "I know a different version of that," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't trade what was mine. I was just convinced it wasn't worth having, convinced I should be grateful people tolerated me at all." She said it plainly, without performance, the way you can only say something after you've turned it over enough times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. "It sounds different from what you're describing, but I think it ends up in the same place." He was still looking at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before. Not pity, which she would have stepped back from, but recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has been holding a wound in private and just heard someone name it out loud. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it does." They walked the rest of the route in near silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. And when they reached the corner where they usually said goodbye, he stood there a moment longer than usual, like he was deciding something. He didn't say what he decided. He just said goodnight and walked away. And Mara watched him go and felt that small, dangerous thing in her chest again, bigger now, less easy to dismiss. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her apartment, small but hers, full of books and one very old houseplant she had somehow kept alive for 6 years. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about the way he had said, "yeah." That single word, the weight he'd put in it without trying. She thought about what it would cost her to want this. She thought about every time she had wanted something and pulled back before it could be taken from her. Every relationship she'd let atrophy because she'd decided preemptively that she wasn't worth the effort of being kept. Every time Celine had taken something from a room and Mara had told herself she hadn't wanted it anyway. She thought about what Dr. Okafor had said, the survival strategy that was destroying her. And then she thought about something else, something she hadn't let herself think yet. She thought about his family, the company. The name she had, by the third week, finally looked up and found spread across 3 real estate developments and 2 architectural awards and 1 very old photograph in a business magazine of a cold-eyed man who looked exactly like Adrian would look in 30 years, standing in front of a building that bore their name in steel letters 4 feet tall. People like that had worlds that didn't expand easily to include people like her. She knew that. She'd always known that. She told herself she was fine with it, that this was just a friendship, that she was being practical, not cowardly. Outside her window, the city hummed in the dark. The houseplant sat on the windowsill in the faint glow of the streetlight, 6 years of surviving against the odds, and Mara looked at it for a long time. Then her phone lit up on the nightstand. A text from an unsaved number she didn't recognize at first, until she read it. I looked up the displacement statistics you cited. You were right. I think I need to revisit 3 projects. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, without letting herself think about it too hard, she typed back, "Told you." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Don't be smug about it. It's unbecoming." She smiled at her phone in the dark of her apartment. Really smiled. Not the practice kind, the real kind. The kind that moves your whole face without asking permission. And she did not know, in that moment, that somewhere across the city, a woman named Vivian Kestrel was sitting in a study lined with leather-bound books and oil paintings, holding a glass of wine, reading a private report her assistant had prepared. A report that included Mara Ellsworth's name, her employment history, her family background, her sister's social profile, the modest square footage of her apartment. Vivian Kestrel set down her wine. Her expression did not change. It very rarely did. She picked up her phone and made a call. And whatever she said on that call would begin moving toward Mara like weather, slow, inevitable, and already decided before anyone thought to check the sky. The text exchange lasted 11 minutes that night and then went quiet, the way good conversations sometimes do. Not because they've ended, but because they've reached a natural resting place, a breath between movements. Mara set her phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark and told herself, again, that she was being practical, that she knew the shape of this thing and she was managing it correctly, that wanting something and pursuing it were 2 different decisions, and she had only committed to the first one. She believed approximately 40% of that. The other 60% was still smiling at her ceiling. Across the city, Vivian Kestrel's phone call lasted 23 minutes. Her assistant, a precise young man named Elliot, who had learned very quickly that his job was to provide information and withhold opinions, answered every question without inflection. When the call ended, Vivian poured the rest of her wine down the kitchen sink, a habit she had when her mind needed to be sharp, and went to bed. She slept without difficulty. She always did. Vivian had long ago learned to treat problems as schedules, and schedules as control, and control as the only real currency in a world that would take everything else if you let it. She was not a villain. That was the complicated thing about her. She was a woman who had survived by building walls so precisely engineered that she had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that the person she'd originally been building them to protect was still inside them, alone, wondering when the construction was going to stop. But none of that was visible yet. What was visible 3 weeks later was a Tuesday morning coffee that Adrian arrived to looking like he hadn't slept, his jaw set in that particular way Mara had begun to recognize. Not anger exactly, but the tight-wound quality of a man holding something that wants to come out. She waited until they'd both had half their coffee. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. A door she was opening. He turned his cup in his hands. "My mother called." "About?" He looked at her then, directly, and there was something apologetic in it that made her stomach drop slightly. That animal instinct for incoming damage that the body registers before the mind catches up. "She heard I've been spending time with someone," he said. She had questions. Mara kept her face steady. She had years of practice at this. What kind of questions? The kind she asks when she's already done her own research and is checking whether I'll be honest about it. The coffee shop was warm around them, the particular warmth of a small room in autumn, the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter, 2 women at the next table arguing cheerfully about something that sounded like a renovation project. Ordinary Tuesday sounds. Mara sat in the middle of all of it and felt the shape of a conversation that had happened without her, about her, and tried not to let the familiar cold feeling settle into her chest. "And were you?" she asked. "Honest. I told her I was spending time with someone I respected," he said. "I told her it wasn't her business." "That's not the same as honest." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. He looked back. The espresso machine hissed again. "Adrian?" She said his name carefully, the way you set something fragile on a surface you're not sure will hold it. "I need you to be straight with me. Is this—" She gestured vaguely between them, which was not like her. She hated vague gestures, but she couldn't find the exact word that fit without it costing more than she was ready to spend. "Is this something you actually want? Or is it something that's been easy because it's been contained, Because we've been meeting in places where nobody from your world is watching. The question hung there. He didn't flinch from it, which she'd half expected him to. Instead, he set down his cup and leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at her with an expression that was working very hard at honesty. "I want this," he said. "I want you, whatever this is. I haven't felt like a person in a very long time, Mara, and I feel like a person when I'm with you. That's not nothing. That's not easy to find." "No," she said quietly. "It's not. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you my family is going to be simple about it. My mother is—" He stopped, searched for the word. "Precise. About the kind of life she thinks I should be living." "Precise," Mara repeated. "She has a vision for the company, for me, for what the next Kestrel generation looks like. And I've spent 34 years performing inside that vision." He said it without self-pity, which was what made it land hard, just a flat accounting of fact. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you'd be walking toward. Not because I think it should stop you. I think—" He paused again, and this pause was different, was the pause of a man choosing honesty over safety. "I think she's wrong about a lot of things, and I'm tired of being too polite to say so." Mara sat with that for a moment. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, a bus went by, and someone on the sidewalk pressed into a doorway to let it pass. "Okay," she said finally. He blinked. "Okay. I heard you. Thank you for telling me." She picked up her cold coffee and drank some of it anyway, because her hands needed something to do. "Now I need you to hear me." She set the cup down and met his eyes and did not look away. "I have spent my entire adult life making myself smaller so that other people would be comfortable. I have watched myself disappear in increments, and I called it being considerate, and I called it being realistic, and it wasn't either of those things. It was fear, and I am genuinely trying not to let fear make my decisions anymore." She could hear her own breathing. She could feel her pulse in her throat, that traitor. "So I'm not walking away because your mother has opinions. I'm also not pretending they don't matter. I'm just—" She exhaled, rough and honest. "I'm still here. That's what I've got right now. I'm still here." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved, the way things move underwater. "You see the motion before you understand the cause." "Yeah," he said. The same word. The same weight. "Me too." They finished their coffee. They walked out into the gray morning. They did not fix anything. But they walked out together, which was its own kind of answer. The problem with things not being fixed is that they keep moving. 2 days later, Mara was in a department store. One of the big ones, 5 floors. The kind that sells perfume on the ground floor, so you have to walk through a cloud of expensive aspiration to get to anything you actually came for. She was there because she needed a new coat, a practical errand, an ordinary Thursday. She rode the elevator to the 4th floor, where the outerwear was, and stepped in behind 2 women she'd never seen before. Late 30s, expensively dressed, the particular ease of women who have never once worried about the cost of a coat. The elevator doors closed. Mara was standing slightly behind them, to the right. They were mid-conversation, the way people continue conversations through transitions, through doorways and elevator rides, and the small interruptions of moving through a city. I know, one of them was saying, but you have to admit she would look so much better if she just—" The other one laughed. "Some people just don't know what suits them. Like, the effort is there, but—" The first one glanced backward, just briefly. The reflexive glance of someone in an elevator, checking who else is in the box with her. Her eyes moved across Mara without pausing. Then she turned back to her friend and lowered her voice by approximately 30%. Not a whisper, not even close to a whisper, just the performance of discretion, and said something that ended with the phrase, "wearing that." Mara looked at the elevator doors. The numbers climbed. 2. 3. She had heard it. She'd heard the specific phrase and she'd processed it, and her brain had very efficiently, in the 2 seconds between the 2nd and 3rd floor, handed her the full interpretation, all of its edges sharp and ready. 4. The doors opened. The 2 women stepped out, still talking, and turned left. Mara stood in the elevator doorway for a moment. The doors tried to close, and she stepped through them and stood on the fourth floor of this store and felt the world become very small and very loud simultaneously. That particular psychological phenomenon where the external environment gets both distant and overwhelming, where the fluorescent lights suddenly seem too bright and the carpet pattern is somehow unbearable, and her own heartbeat is the loudest sound she can hear. She found a rack of coats and stood in front of it and put her hand on the fabric of the nearest one and breathed. In, out. The panic was different from sadness. People who hadn't experienced it sometimes confused the two, thought it must be like crying, like grief, something that moved through and released. It wasn't. It was more like drowning in a place where there was plenty of air, her body insisting on catastrophe while her mind tried to file paperwork proving otherwise. Her hands had gone cold. The fluorescent lights, the carpet pattern. The coat in her hand was green, wool. She couldn't have told you what shade. She made it to the parking garage. She didn't remember the elevator ride down or walking through the perfume cloud or pushing through the doors. She just found herself in the dim concrete of the garage, her car a gray shape 40 feet away, and she got to it and got inside and pulled the door shut and sat there. She put her hands on the steering wheel. She pressed her forehead against it. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She ignored it. Then it rang. An actual call, which nobody made anymore without warning, and she thought distantly that it was probably Gerald about something work-related, and she should answer it because she was a professional, and she was fine. She was absolutely fine. She looked at the screen. Adrian. She stared at his name for 2 full rings. Then she answered. Hey! Her voice came out wrong. She knew it immediately. Too flat. The air too controlled. The specific sound of a person holding something together with both hands. A pause on his end. Short. Where are you? Not where are you calling from, not what are you up to, not the casual preamble of a normal phone call, just where are you? Like he already knew something was wrong and was skipping to the relevant information. Parking garage, she said, Mercer Street, the big department store. I'll be there in 8 minutes, he said. You don't have to. 8 minutes. He hung up. She sat in the car in the parking garage and breathed in the particular smell of concrete and exhaust and underground air, and she tried to put herself back together before he arrived, because that was what she did. She put herself back together before anyone could see the pieces, and this time she couldn't quite get there. The pieces kept shifting. The fluorescent lights were still too bright even though she was in a parking garage, and there were no fluorescent lights. The 2 women in the elevator. The lowered voice. 30 years of being looked at that way, and she should have been armored by now. She had always thought she was armored by now. She was not armored. She heard footsteps on concrete, quick, purposeful, and then his shape appeared in the side window, and he pulled the passenger door open without asking and got in. He was in a suit, charcoal, pressed, the working clothes of a man who had clearly come directly from somewhere with a meeting in it. There was a slight wind roughness to his hair, like he'd walked fast enough for it to matter. He looked at her, not with the assessing look of someone cataloging damage, but with the still direct look of someone who has decided that being present is the only thing that's required right now. He didn't say anything at first. Mara was still holding the steering wheel with both hands, even though the car wasn't on. She realized that and let go and put her hands in her lap, which felt wrong, so she pressed them flat against her thighs. 2 women in an elevator, she said, because somehow it was easier to just start talking than to manage the silence. They didn't even know my name. I don't know their names. It was nothing. It was 30 seconds. Her voice sounded strange to her, like it was coming from a few inches outside her body. I've heard worse. I've heard way worse from people who knew me. I don't know why. You don't have to explain it, he said. I feel like I do. You don't. She looked at him then. He was sitting slightly sideways in the seat, facing her, and he looked absurd in this parking garage in that suit, and she would have laughed at that, except that laughing felt about 1,000 miles away. I don't want you to see me like this, she said, and the honesty of it surprised her even as she said it. Like what? Like this. She gestured at herself. Falling apart in a parking garage over 2 strangers. You're not falling apart, he said. You're sitting in your car. That's about as put together as most people get on a bad day. Adrian. Mara. He said her name the same way she'd said his, 2 weeks ago in the coffee shop. a door opening. She looked at the concrete wall ahead of her. I spent most of my life being told, in 100 different ways, that I was too much, too soft, taking up too much space. My sister has this way of— She stopped, started again. I love Celine, I do. But she spent 30 years making me feel like a rough draft of a person. And I've spent 30 years thinking that if I could just fix the right things, be smaller here, quieter there, then eventually I'd deserve to be in the same room as everyone else. Her jaw ached. She realized she'd been clenching it. I thought I was past this. I thought I'd made enough progress that two strangers in an elevator couldn't just reach in and— She stopped. Adrian reached over and put his hand over hers. Not reaching for her hand, not clasping it, just placing his hand over both of hers where they were pressed flat against her thighs. Warm, steady, still. She looked down at his hand, then she looked up at the concrete wall. I used to cry in this car, he said after a moment. After my father's meetings, I'd get in the car and I'd drive to the parking structure near his office. Not this one. This is the wrong side of the city. And I'd sit in there and I'd just let it out. Whatever he'd said that day. Whatever he'd made me feel small about. He paused. I was 31 years old. I was running 3 major development projects. And I was sitting in a parking structure crying into my steering wheel because my father had told me I was thinking about legacy wrong. He paused. He didn't look at her while he said it. He looked at the same concrete wall. That's the thing about that kind of wound, he said. Doesn't matter how old you get. Doesn't matter what you've built or how far you've come. Someone says the wrong thing and you're 12 years old again, and nothing you've accomplished since then feels like proof of anything. The parking garage hummed around them. Someone else's car started 3 rows over, the engine sound bouncing off concrete, and then the tires squealed softly on the polished floor as it moved away. Mara turned her hand over under his. Just turned it, so her palm was against his palm. He curled his fingers around it. They sat like that for a while. Long enough that her heartbeat came back to a normal rhythm. Long enough that the light stopped feeling too bright. Long enough that the parking garage became just a parking garage again, cold and concrete and ordinary. I need to tell you something, she said eventually. Okay, I'm not good at being helped. I want to be, I'm trying to be, but my instinct when someone gets too close to something real is to manage them out of it. To wrap it up and say I'm fine and give them a way to leave before they decide to on their own. I noticed, he said, it's probably going to happen again. I'll probably push you back. You can try, he said. She looked at him sideways. That's cocky. It's accurate. She almost laughed. Didn't quite get there, but almost. It was the closest she'd come in the last 40 minutes, and it felt like something thawing at the edge of a winter that had lasted too long. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting in that parking garage with their hands folded together in the gray quiet, was that Celine had called twice in the last 20 minutes. That the 2 missed calls were sitting in Mara's bag unheard, alongside a third call from their mother, who had apparently been told something by Celine, who had apparently been told something by one of the women at the charity gala, who knew someone who knew the name Kestrel and had taken the trouble to mention it. The chain of it was already in motion. Information moving the way it always moves in small, tight social worlds, laterally through connections, arriving at its destination by routes nobody planned. Celine Ellsworth was not unintelligent, whatever else she was, and she was many things, some of them not flattering. She was sharp, and she was observant, and 3 weeks of watching her sister come home from coffee and evening walks with a different quality of aliveness had not escaped her. Mara stood differently. Mara held her head at a slightly different angle. Mara had laughed, twice, at things on her phone while they were at dinner, and both times had not offered to explain what was funny, and both times Celine had noticed the not offering and had felt something she would have described as concern, but which, if she were being honest with herself, had a sharper edge to it than concern usually does. Celine called a third time. Mara's phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. She would not ignore it forever. She would call Celine back, probably tonight, and Celine would say whatever Celine had to say, and the conversation that had been building for years beneath the surface of their sisterhood would finally start moving toward the ground. But that was tonight. That was later. Right now there was a parking garage and a hand that hadn't let go and a silence that didn't need to be filled. Come on, Adrian said eventually. I'll buy you something to eat. There's a place 2 blocks from here that makes soup that might actually be capable of fixing a bad day. Soup doesn't fix bad days. This soup might. It's aggressive about it. She looked at him. Aggressive soup. Confrontational, even. She did laugh this time. Small, rough, real. They got out of the car. He walked around to her side without making a thing of it, and they went up through the parking garage and out into the gray afternoon, and he did not let go of her hand until they reached the door of the restaurant, and even then it was gradual, the way warmth leaves a room, slowly, by degrees, and you notice it only when it's already mostly gone. The soup was genuinely very good. She drove home that evening with her heater running and the radio on something low and thoughtful, and she felt scraped clean in the way that only the worst afternoons leave you. Not good, not fixed, but lighter, like something that had been lodged had finally worked itself loose. She thought about what he'd said about the parking structure near his father's office, the specificity of it, the way he'd said it to the concrete wall and not to her face, which had somehow made it more honest, not less. She thought about his hand over hers. She thought about Celine's 3 missed calls. She pulled into her street, found a parking spot 2 buildings down from hers, turned off the engine, sat for a moment. The houseplant was visible in her window from here. She'd left the lamp on. A small lit square in the facade of the building, ordinary and specific in hers. She picked up her phone and called Celine back. Celine answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," Celine said. No hello, no preamble. Her voice was the particular tight frequency of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation. "Okay," Mara said. "Not on the phone. Can you come over tomorrow?" "Celine, just say whatever." "Tomorrow, Mara, please." A pause. Something underneath the tightness, something softer and more complicated, something Mara couldn't quite identify. "I need to say this right, and I can't do that on the phone." Mara looked at her building, the lit window, the houseplant in silhouette. "What time?" she said. "Noon?" "Fine." She hung up and sat in her car in the dark, and something in her stomach told her, with the quiet certainty of a body that knows things before the mind catches up, that tomorrow noon was going to break something open that had been sealed for a very long time. She was not wrong. Celine's apartment was on the 11th floor of a building in the west end of the city, one of those newer constructions with floor-to-ceiling windows and a concierge who remembered your name and a lobby that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive candles. Mara had been there maybe a dozen times in the 3 years since Celine had moved in, and each time she felt the same thing walking through the lobby, that particular combination of admiration and displacement, the feeling of being a guest in a version of life that somehow belonged to someone else. She took the elevator up. Noon exactly. She had not slept well. Celine opened the door before Mara could knock, which meant she'd been watching through the peephole, which meant she'd been standing at the door, which meant she was more wound up about this than her voice on the phone had let on. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater and her hair was down, and she looked, without the full armor of her usual presentation, younger than 29 and more tired than she'd ever let Mara see before. "Come in," she said. The apartment was immaculate in the way Celine kept all her spaces, deliberately arranged, nothing accidental, every object placed with the unconscious precision of someone who needs their environment to project the right image even when no one else is watching. There was fresh coffee on the kitchen counter, 2 mugs already poured. Celine had prepared for this. Mara sat down at the kitchen island, picked up the mug, didn't drink from it. Celine stood on the other side of the island with her own mug and looked at Mara with an expression that Mara had never seen on her sister's face before, not in 28 years of sharing birthdays and holidays and the specific purgatory of family gatherings. It was the expression of someone who has decided to put something down that they've been carrying for a long time and is not sure their arms will work correctly once the weight is gone. "I know about Adrian Kestrel," Celine said. Mara set her mug down. "Not because I was snooping," Celine said quickly, then stopped, then said, "Actually, partially because I was snooping. Diane Mercer saw you two at the Halcyon Gala, and she mentioned it to someone, and it came around to me." She looked at the counter. "I looked him up." "Okay," Mara said. Her voice was very even. She was working hard on keeping it that way. "Do you know who his family is?" "Yes." "I don't mean the money, Mara. I mean, do you know what that family is like? What they expect? I talked to someone who went to school with Adrian's younger cousin, and the way that family operates is Celine. Mara said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. Celine stopped. Is that what you needed to tell me? That I'm out of my depth? That I don't understand what I'm getting into? Mara kept her voice level, but there was something underneath it now, something with pressure behind it. Because I need you to think very carefully before you answer that. I need you to think about whether you're about to give me a warning or a verdict. Because those are different things, and they lead to a very different conversation. Celine was quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren moved through the city below them, rising and fading. I'm trying to protect you, Celine said. From what? From getting hurt. From... Celine pressed her lips together, looked away. From building something on a foundation that was never designed to hold you. The words landed. Mara felt them land. She picked up her mug again, took a slow drink of the coffee, set it down. Her hands were steady, and she was glad of it. Never designed to hold me, she repeated. That's not... I didn't mean it like... How did you mean it? Celine looked at her. There was something genuinely pained in it. That was the complicated thing about Celine. She was not without feeling, had never been without feeling. She was a woman who had caused damage without understanding the shape of what she was doing, which was a different category of failure than cruelty, but it left the same marks. I meant that those families don't work the way normal families do, Celine said. They have criteria. They have a type. And I don't want you to get in deep and then find out you don't fit the criteria and have it, her voice caught slightly, have it do to you what it would do to you. I know how you take things. I know how you carry things. You know how I take things, Mara said slowly. Yes. Because you've spent 30 years watching me? She tilted her head, just slightly. Or because you've spent 30 years making me take things a certain way, and you know the mechanism because you built it. The kitchen went very quiet. Celine's face changed. Not dramatically, not a flinch, but a shift. The subtle rearrangement of features when something hits a place the speaker wasn't expecting to be touched. That's not fair, Celine said. The boutique, Mara said. 3 weeks ago, the zipper. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if she'd said it with fury. In front of your friends and the sales associate and anyone else in the room. You've done things like that my whole life, Celine. Small things. Things you could always call a joke. Things I was always too managed to call you on. I was joking. I know you were joking. Mara leaned forward slightly on the stool. That's the part that's always confused me. I know you don't sit around thinking about ways to make me small. I know it's not calculated. But do you know what's worse than someone deliberately trying to diminish you? She waited. Celine didn't answer. Someone doing it automatically, without even noticing, because the habit is so old it doesn't require thought anymore. Celine put her mug down on the counter with a soft sound. Her jaw was tight. So that's what we're doing today, she said. Okay. Fine, let's do it. Her voice had shifted too. The softness was gone, replaced by something sharper, the defensive register of a woman who has been comfortable in a role and is watching it be taken apart. You want to talk about the boutique? Let's talk about the boutique. Let's talk about how I have spent our entire lives trying to include you, dragging you to events, introducing you to people, trying to get you out of that quiet little shell you live in. I didn't ask to be dragged anywhere. No, you never ask for anything, Mara. That's the problem. You just sit there in your quiet martyrdom and wait for people to figure out what you need, and when they get it wrong, you file it away. You've been filing things away for 20 years and now you're going to sit in my kitchen and read me the whole archive? Mara absorbed that. She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a wave, not fighting it, just waiting for it to move through. You're not entirely wrong, she said. That knocked the momentum out of Celine's voice. She'd been ready for anger. She wasn't ready for concession. I do that, Mara continued. I go quiet instead of saying the thing. I've done it my whole life, and I've blamed you for not knowing things I never told you, which isn't entirely fair. She paused. But Celine, the reason I went quiet isn't a mystery. The reason I learned to say nothing is because every time I said something, every time I tried to take up the space that was supposed to be mine, there you were. Brighter, louder, easier. And everyone turned toward you the way they do, the way they always have, And I was very young when I learned this, that the only way to survive in the same room as you was to need less. Celine's eyes were bright. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was working very hard right now not to. I didn't know, she said. Her voice was stripped down to something raw. I didn't know you felt that way. I know you didn't, Mara said. That's the point. They stayed in that kitchen for another 2 hours. It was not a clean conversation. It didn't resolve neatly. There were moments where Celine's defenses went back up, and Mara had to decide whether to push through them or let them stand. There were moments where Mara said something that was too sharp and had to walk it back without retracting the truth of it. There were tears, eventually, Celine's first, and then, unexpectedly, Mara's. The kind that come not from sadness, but from the specific release of finally saying out loud something that has been true in your body for decades. When Mara left just past 2 in the afternoon, nothing was fixed. The fracture was still a fracture, but it was visible now, which was different from pretending it wasn't there. You can only repair what you can see. She drove home with her eyes dry and her chest hollow in the specific way that difficult honesty leaves you. Emptied out, raw-edged, but also, underneath the rawness, something that might eventually become solid if you left it alone long enough to set. She did not call Adrian that afternoon. She needed to think. She needed 48 hours and 3 long walks and 1 night of insomnia before she could articulate, even to herself, what was shifting inside her. But she felt it moving. The thing that had been locked in place her whole life, the load-bearing belief that she was a person to be tolerated rather than chosen. It had a crack in it now, just a crack. But cracks have a way of spreading. What she did not know, in those 48 hours, was that across the city, in a house that had the same quality as Celine's apartment, but multiplied by a factor that made it architectural rather than domestic, Vivian Kestrel was having a conversation with her son. She had requested it formally, not called, sent a message through his assistant, which was how Vivian operated when she wanted to make clear that a conversation was a matter of record rather than an impulse. Adrian had shown up to the family house on a Wednesday evening, knowing the shape of what was coming and deciding that this time, for once in his adult life, he was not going to perform his way through it. Vivian was in the sitting room. This was intentional. The sitting room was her room, arranged to her specific taste, every piece of furniture positioned to give her the slight advantage of the familiar. She was wearing a charcoal jacket and her reading glasses pushed up on her head the way she did when she'd been working and hadn't bothered to put them away. And she looked, as she always looked, like a woman who has decided how this conversation is going to end before it has begun. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her teacup with the specific expression she reserved for when he was trying her patience. "Suit yourself." "You went through Elliot to schedule this," he said. "You've never done that before. So whatever this is, just say it." "I've been patient," Vivian said. "With what?" "With this situation. This relationship, or whatever you're calling it." She set her teacup down precisely in its saucer. "I gave you space to work through whatever this is. I did not say anything when you started rearranging your schedule. I did not say anything when you missed the Hartwell dinner. I waited, because I thought you'd come to your senses on your own." She paused. "You haven't come to my senses," Adrian repeated. "She's not suitable, Adrian." The room was very still, the kind of stillness that a well-built house makes. Solid, insulated, all the noise of the outside world pressed back to a murmur. "Explain what that means," he said. His voice was even. He was working on keeping it that way. "You know exactly what it means." "I want to hear you say it." Vivienne looked at him. There was something in her expression that might have been, in a different woman, uncertainty. But Vivian had long ago reconfigured uncertainty into resolve, and what came out of her face was just the resolve, polished smooth and unreadable. "She does not come from the kind of background that can support what this family requires publicly," Vivian said. "She works for a small nonprofit. She lives alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. She has a sister who is visible in the kind of social circles that create complications. She is a pleasant person, I am certain. But pleasant and appropriate are different categories, and you have responsibilities to this family's legacy that cannot be subordinated to—" "Stop." He said it quietly. That was the difference between this conversation and every other one they'd had. He didn't raise his voice because he had finally run out of the energy that shouting requires. What was underneath the shouting was something colder and more certain. I'm going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not process it, not file it under Adrian being emotional. Hear it. Vivian was quiet. I have done everything that was asked of me, he said. Every board meeting, every acquisition, every carefully selected event with every carefully selected person. I have been the kestrel that this family required for 15 years, and I have done it at the cost of every single thing that was actually mine. My time, my choices. The 3 years I spent wanting to work with a design firm instead of the company, and I stayed because you asked me to. The relationship at 28 that I ended because she didn't fit your criteria. He paused. That's not strength. That's not legacy. That's a man who has spent his entire adult life in a very expensive, very comfortable cage and calling it duty. Vivian's jaw had tightened, just slightly. The only tell. And Mara, he continued, is the first person in longer than I can track who makes me feel like a person rather than an asset. And I am not... His voice broke slightly, not with emotion but with the particular stress fracture of someone pressing through something hard. I am not giving that up because she doesn't have the right background. I'm not. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. You're making a decision based on feeling, she said finally. Feelings are temporary. You don't actually believe that, he said. I beg your pardon? You don't believe feelings are temporary. You believe they're dangerous. Because you had them once and you did what the family required and you've been paying for it ever since. He watched her face. She didn't move. I know about Marcus Veal, Mother. The name moved through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Vivian became absolutely motionless, in the way of a person who has been struck somewhere they'd forgotten was vulnerable. Marcus Veal had been a name Adrian had found 4 years ago, in a letter he hadn't meant to read, a letter left in a jacket pocket of his father's that had been passed along to him after his father's death, along with a collection of papers that nobody had sorted. A letter in handwriting Adrian didn't recognize, dated 32 years ago, that ended with words he hadn't been able to forget. He had never mentioned it. He had held it like a splinter, working around it, waiting for the moment when it would become necessary. That's not relevant, Vivian said. Her voice had changed. It was still controlled, but the quality of the control was different. Effortful now, where before it had been automatic. You were 26, he said quietly, and you chose the family over him. And you've run this family like a fortress ever since, and I've always thought it was because you believed in it. But I think... He stopped, chose the next words carefully. I think you've been trying to make the sacrifice mean something, by making sure nobody else under this roof got to make a different choice. Vivian stood up. It was a slow movement, deliberate, and she walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked out at the garden that had been her husband's domain, and was now maintained by people she paid to keep it looking the same as it always had. Adrian waited. You should go, she said. Mother, I need you to go. Her voice was flat and tight, and underneath it was something he had not heard from her in 20 years, something cracked and human and old. Please. He left. He drove across the city with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind in a place he couldn't quite name, not triumphant, not relieved, not anything clean. He had said the true thing. He had said the thing that needed to be said. But saying the true thing doesn't make it not cost anything. It just makes the cost worthwhile. He texted Mara when he got home. Nothing elaborate, just, are you free this weekend? There's something I want to show you. She texted back 12 minutes later. Yes. What is it? A building. I'll explain when I see you. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Vivian Kestrel, standing at that window for a long time after her son left, had made a phone call. Not to her assistant, not to anyone connected to the company. She had called the woman who was hosting a dinner the following Friday. A dinner she had already planned to attend. A dinner to which, she now arranged, Mara Ellsworth would also be invited, through a chain of connections that would make the invitation appear casual, incidental, a simple overlap of social circles. She wanted to see her. She needed to see her. Not to evaluate her in the abstract, but to look at the woman her son had chosen and decide, with her own eyes and her own judgment, who she actually was. She told herself it was due diligence, She had always been good at telling herself things. Saturday arrived clear and cold, one of those autumn days in the city where the sky is so purely blue it looks artificial, like someone had decided to make a point about it. Adrian picked Mara up at 10 in the morning and drove her 20 minutes east to a part of the city that was mid-transition, not quite finished becoming whatever it was going to be. Old commercial buildings standing next to construction hoardings next to new structures still raw with newness. He parked in front of a building that looked like a former warehouse. 8 stories, brick facade, tall arched windows that had been replaced at some point with modern glass. A development sign on the fence in front listed the Kestrel name and a projected completion date. "This is one of yours," Mara said. "Yes and no." He got out of the car and she followed, and they stood on the sidewalk looking up at it. It was one of my father's acquisitions. The plan was to convert it to luxury commercial space, high-end office units, some retail on the ground floor. The numbers made sense. "But," she said, because there was clearly a but. But the neighborhood already had a community center that was using a building 2 blocks over, leasing it below market rate. And the development we're planning is going to push the lease rate up when it renews. He looked up at the building, and in his face was the same thing she'd seen when he talked about architecture in their early conversations. Something genuine and slightly helpless. The look of a person who cares about something they're not supposed to be distracted by. I kept looking at the ground floor of this building, the arched ceilings, the natural light, and I kept thinking, this could be a community space. This could be where that center goes instead of getting pushed out. What did the board say? "I haven't told the board yet." He looked at her. "I wanted to see what you thought first." She turned and looked at the building for a long moment. The arched windows caught the morning light and threw it back in long parallels across the sidewalk. "I think you already know what you want to do," she said. "I think you've known for a while. And I think you're asking me because you need someone to tell you it's not stupid." "Is it stupid?" "It's going to cost you money." "Yes. And your board is going to push back." "Almost certainly. And it's the right thing to do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah." "Then it's not stupid," she said. "It's just hard. Those are different things." He looked at her, the morning light, the arched windows throwing their shadows across the sidewalk between them. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay. I talked to my mother Wednesday." He watched her face. It stayed steady, which he was beginning to understand was not the same as feeling nothing. "I said things I should have said a long time ago about the cage I've been living in, about what I want." He paused. "About you." Mara's chest tightened. "How did she take it?" "She told me to leave." "Adrian, she's not done," he said. "I know her. She's thinking. She doesn't walk away from things. She reconfigures them." He looked back at the building. "I'm not sure what she's going to do next, but I needed you to know that I had the conversation, that I'm not performing here, that this is a choice I'm making with my eyes open." Mara looked at him for a long time. "Okay," she said. "That's all you've got?" "Okay. I'm saving my words," she said. "I have a feeling I'm going to need them soon." She was not wrong. The invitation arrived Monday morning via email, forwarded through a mutual acquaintance neither of them had thought to worry about. A dinner, Friday evening, hosted by a woman named Catherine Hollis at a residence in the north end of the city. A gathering of what the email described as close friends and colleagues. The invitation included Mara's name, spelled correctly, which meant someone had made sure of it. She read the email twice. Then she looked at the hostess's name and spent 20 minutes on a search that confirmed what she'd already half suspected. Catherine Hollis was on the board of the Kestrel Foundation, had been for 11 years, was, by several accounts, one of Vivian Kestrel's closest friends. She sat at her desk at work and stared at her screen. This was not a coincidence. She had lived long enough and paid enough attention to know that coincidences with the specific architecture of this one didn't exist. She had been placed in this situation deliberately by a woman she had never met, in a room that would be on that woman's terms. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. "Did you get an invitation to a Catherine Hollis dinner on Friday?" she asked. A pause. "Yes. This morning. I assumed—" He stopped. She heard him processing it. The pause went a beat longer. My mother. Yes. Another pause. Mara? Don't apologize, she said. Don't apologize and don't tell me I don't have to go, because those are both things you say when you're trying to manage a situation, and I'm not a situation. He was quiet. I'll go, she said. I'll meet her. On her terms, in her room, with her people. She looked at her desk, her ordinary desk with its coffee ring stain and its stack of program reports. But I need you to understand something. I am going as myself, not as a performance, not as a person trying to pass an audition. Myself exactly as I am. And if that's not enough for her, she stopped, felt the words settle before she said them, making sure they were the right ones. Then we're going to find that out together, you and me, and you're going to have to decide what it means. Silence on the line. I know what it means, he said. Then we're going Friday, she said. And that's where she held the line, clear and unmoving, while somewhere in a North End house, Vivian Kestrel sat with her tea and her certainty and had no idea that the woman she'd maneuvered into a corner had just decided for the first time in her life not to make herself smaller to fit inside it. Friday came the way difficult things always come. Without warning, you'd somehow still been warned, arriving exactly on schedule while part of you had been hoping for a cancellation, a storm, a reasonable excuse to not have to be brave. Mara stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:15 in the evening and looked at herself for a long time. She had chosen a dress that was hers, not the pale blue blouse she hid inside, not the practical invisibility of dark jeans, but a deep burgundy wrap dress she had bought 8 months ago and never worn because wearing it felt like a declaration she hadn't been ready to make. It fit her exactly as it was supposed to. She had not tried to adjust it, compress it, minimize it. She put on the earrings her grandmother had given her 3 years ago and left her hair the way it actually fell when she stopped engineering it. And she looked at herself in the mirror and said quietly, to no one in particular, "This is who I am. This is the whole thing. Take it or leave it." Her voice shook slightly on the last sentence. She picked up her coat and left. Adrian was waiting outside her building. He'd offered to pick her up and she'd accepted because she was choosing her battles carefully tonight, and transportation was not one of them. He was leaning against the car, not on his phone, not distracted, just standing there, watching for her. And when she came through the building door, his eyes moved to her face first, the way they always did. Not the assessment sweep, but the direct connection. And something in his expression went quiet and certain in a way that made her chest do something complicated. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, not harshly. "I don't want to arrive having been told I look something. I want to arrive being something. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah, okay." He opened the car door. Let's go." They drove mostly in silence. The city moved past the windows in its Friday evening configuration. Lit bars, couples on sidewalks, the particular restless energy of a city deciding what kind of night to be. Mara watched it and breathed and kept her hand still in her lap. "She's going to test you," Adrian said, at a red light. He wasn't looking at her, watching the light. "Not obviously. She doesn't do obvious. She'll ask questions that sound like conversation. She'll position you next to people who make her point for her without her having to make it." "I know," Mara said. "And Catherine Hollis is going to be warm to you in a way that's designed to make you relax before my mother gets to work." "I know that too." He glanced at her. "You're not scared." "I'm terrified," she said evenly. "But I've been terrified my whole life, and I've been letting it run me. Tonight I'm going to be terrified and do it anyway. There's a difference." The light changed. He drove. "If it gets bad," he said, "you look at me. Just find my face." She looked at his profile in the low light of the car, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of a man who has made a decision and is no longer second-guessing it. "Okay," she said. Catherine Hollis lived in a brownstone on Carver Street that had the quiet confidence of old money that had never needed to prove itself. No ostentatious facade, no statement architecture, just a beautiful old building kept perfectly and lit from within with the amber warmth of a house that had been genuinely lived in for decades. A housekeeper opened the door before they reached it. They were expected. The entry hall had original hardwood floors and oil paintings and the faint smell of gardenias from an arrangement on the console table. And from deeper in the house came the sound of conversation, crystal on crystal, the acoustic of a gathering that had already found its rhythm before they arrived. Catherine Hollis materialized from the direction of the sound, smiling, both hands extended. A tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut short and a genuine warmth that made you want to trust her before you'd assessed whether you should. She took Mara's hands in hers and said, "Mara, I'm so glad you came. Adrian's talked about you." She looked at Adrian. "She's lovely." Back to Mara, steering her gently toward the gathered room. Come in, come in. We were just starting on the wine." Mara registered the steering, the gentle practiced hospitality of it. She went along and kept her eyes clear and her spine straight. The room held about 14 people. Mara cataloged them in the first 30 seconds, not anxiously, but methodically, the way you learn to read a room when you've spent your life being sensitive to its currents. Couples mostly, mid-40s to mid-60s, the specific social ease of people who have known each other long enough that the performance has mostly dropped away. A man near the fireplace who was clearly someone's brother, standing slightly apart the way people do at parties they've been brought to rather than invited to. And at the far end of the room near the tall windows that looked out over the garden, a woman in charcoal gray. Vivienne Kestrel did not look toward the door when they entered. She was in conversation, her head angled toward the man beside her, and she appeared completely absorbed in whatever he was saying. It was, Mara understood immediately, a performance. She was certain of it the way you're certain of weather coming. Not because you can see it yet, but because you can feel it in your joints. Adrian's hand pressed briefly against the small of her back, not guiding her, not steering, just contact. And then he was pulled into conversation by the man near the fireplace, who apparently knew him, and Mara was standing with a glass of wine she'd accepted from a passing tray and nowhere in particular to be. She chose to be somewhere. She walked to the cluster near the windows, not toward Vivienne directly, toward the general area, stopping to introduce herself to a couple named Brent and Diane, who turned out to work in urban planning and with whom, within 4 minutes, she was having a genuine conversation about green infrastructure and the city's failure to invest in it. She knew this subject. She cared about this subject. She let that show. And Brent, who had been talking about it professionally for 20 years and rarely encountered someone at a dinner party who could hold up their end of it, leaned forward slightly and got the energized look of a person who has found unexpected common ground. She was aware at the edges of her awareness of Vivienne, not looking at her, just aware. It was 12 minutes before Vivienne moved. Mara tracked it peripherally. The smooth disengagement from her previous conversation, the unhurried progress across the room, the way people adjusted slightly around her, the way space adjusts around a fixed point. She came to stand at the edge of Mara's conversation with Brent and Diane, as if she'd been drawn there by the content rather than the person, and Brent immediately included her. "Vivienne, you know the East Side development better than anyone." "I know it reasonably well," Vivienne said, and her voice was what Mara had expected and hadn't fully prepared for. Precise, modulated, the voice of a woman who has never once said a word by accident. She looked at Mara directly. "I don't believe we've met." "Mara Ellsworth." She held the eye contact. Didn't reach for the handshake, let Vivienne determine the formality. Vivienne looked at her, not the catalog assessment of appearance that Mara had braced for, but something more thorough and less legible than that. A look that moved across Mara the way a reader moves across a page, looking for the argument underneath the words. "Adrian mentioned you work in educational equity," Vivienne said. "He mentioned me," Mara said, the smallest pause. "He did? Then yes. Nonprofit sector, about 6 years. Before that, I worked in policy research." She didn't over-explain. Didn't fill the silence that followed with the anxious elaboration of someone who needs to justify their resume. She just said it and let it sit. Vivienne asked a question about the nonprofit's funding model. Mara answered. Vivienne asked a follow-up that was sharper than the first, the kind of question that separates people who know a subject from people who perform knowing it. Mara answered that too, directly, with the specific numbers and the specific challenge, because she actually knew this, actually lived this, and she was not going to soften it to make it more impressive or more palatable. Brent made a comment. Diane laughed at something. The conversation moved, and for the next 40 minutes, over the gradual migration toward the dining table, through the first course and the second, Vivienne Kestrel engaged Mara Ellsworth in a conversation that was, on its surface, entirely pleasant. City planning, equity work, the challenges of institutional change, the specific geography of the East Side neighborhood where Adrian's building stood. It was intelligent conversation between two intelligent women, and it was also, underneath, something else entirely. It was an examination, a structured, patient, professional-grade examination conducted over linen and silverware and very good wine, and Mara felt every question land and chose every answer with the same care she had chosen her dress. Not to impress, but to be accurate. To be herself, exactly and without apology. She did not defer. When Vivian made a statement Mara disagreed with, about the viability of community-integrated development, a mild skepticism delivered with the confidence of someone who has made decisions in this space, Mara said, clearly and without hedging, "I'd push back on that. The data from the 3 projects I can cite directly suggests the model is more viable than the conventional analysis gives it credit for. The issue is usually timeline expectations, not the model itself." Vivian looked at her. "Which projects?" she said. Mara named them, gave the specifics. Vivian listened with the focused quality of someone who is revising a position in real time, but has not yet decided whether to let that show. Across the table, Adrian was watching. Not overtly. He was in his own conversation, performing it correctly. But Mara caught his eye once, briefly, and he had the expression of a man watching something he can't interfere with and has decided to trust. She looked away from him. She didn't need the anchor right now. She was anchored. Then Catherine, at the head of the table, said something to the group. A light conversational pivot. The kind a skilled host uses to circulate energy around a dinner table. Something about change, about how people manage transition. And one of the other guests, the woman named Diane, said something about how change was hardest for people who hadn't chosen it, and someone else agreed, and the conversation began to eddy the way dinner party conversations do, loosely personal, pleasantly general. And Vivian said, still looking at Mara, but speaking to the table, "I think the most difficult changes are the ones that require us to admit we've been wrong about something foundational. The longer you've built on a particular belief, the more costly it is to revise it." The table murmured general agreement. Mara looked at Vivian. Vivian was looking back at her. And in that look was something Mara hadn't expected. Not hostility, not the cold appraisal she'd been bracing for all evening. Something more complicated, something that had weight in it, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, something like a woman asking a question she can't ask out loud. Mara said, to the table and to Vivian in equal measure, "I think the cost of revising a belief is always less than the cost of living in the wrong one long enough. The revision hurts once. The wrong belief keeps collecting interest." Silence for a beat. Then Brent laughed and said something about compound interest, and the moment broke into general conversation again. But Vivian had not looked away, and something in her face had moved. After dinner, the group dispersed into the natural clusters of a gathering winding toward its end. Some people migrating toward a sitting room, others staying at the table with the last of the wine. Mara found herself near the entry hall, coat in hand, Adrian beside her, saying their goodbyes to Catherine when she felt, rather than heard, someone come to stand behind her. She turned. Vivian was there. She had her coat already, which meant she was also leaving, which meant this was not accidental. She looked at Mara with that same unreadable precision. "I'd like to say something," Vivian said, quietly. Meant for Mara, and by proximity, for Adrian. Adrian went very still. "I came here tonight with a specific intention," Vivian said. "I want you to know that because I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. I intended to assess whether my earlier evaluation of this situation was accurate." She paused. The entry hall had the quality of a held breath. "My earlier evaluation was that you were unsuitable. I want you to know I've revised that." Mara felt the words move through her. She kept her face still. "That's not an apology," Vivian continued, and there was something in her voice that was working against itself. The precise woman fighting with the real one. "I don't offer those easily. What I'm offering is accuracy. You are not what I assumed, and my assumptions have—" She stopped, looked briefly at her son, then back at Mara. "They've cost this family more than I've been willing to account for." The front door of the brownstone was a few feet away. Outside, the Friday night city continued its business, indifferent. "Mrs. Kestrel," Mara said. Her voice was steady. I didn't come tonight to pass a test. I came because your son matters to me, and because I was done letting other people's opinions of me live in my body rent-free. She held the woman's gaze. I don't need your approval to be with Adrian, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter at all. Because it matters to him, and he matters to me. So yes, I'll take the revision. Something crossed Vivian's face. Fast. Gone. Good night, Vivian said. Good night, Mara said. Vivian walked past them and out the door, and her heels were precise on the steps, and she did not look back. Adrian exhaled beside Mara. A long, slow breath, the specific sound of a man releasing pressure he'd been holding for several hours. That was... he started. Don't say anything, Mara said. Not yet. I need a minute. He nodded. She stood in Catherine Hollis's entry hall and breathed and felt the evening's tension beginning to drain out of her extremities. Her hands were cold. She hadn't realized they were cold. She pressed them together. What she didn't know yet, couldn't know, standing in that warm entry hall, was that Vivian, walking toward her car on the quiet street outside, had stopped on the pavement for a moment, had stood in the cold air with her car keys in her hand, and had felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not regret. Not quite. Something adjacent to it. Something that had the shape of a memory of being 26 years old with a letter she hadn't answered and a choice she'd made that had been, by every objective measure, the correct choice, and that had cost her something she had been paying for in installments ever since. She stood on that pavement for 4 seconds. Then she got in the car and drove home. And that night, for the first time in over a decade, she opened the drawer in her study where she kept things she didn't look at, and she took out a photograph. And she sat with it for a long time in the quiet of her house, without doing anything in particular except finally, at 61 years old, letting herself feel what it actually weighed. Saturday morning, Mara woke up before her alarm, which she never did. She lay in her bed in the early gray light and stared at the ceiling and took inventory. She was still here. She had not diminished herself to fit. She had walked into that room as herself, and she had stayed herself for the entire 4 hours, and the ceiling had not fallen, and no one had laughed her out of the building, and Vivian Kestrel, the human fortress, had looked at her and revised her position. She pressed her hand flat against her own sternum, felt her heartbeat, steady. Her phone lit up. She expected Adrian. It was Celine. Can I come over today? I have something to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago. Mara stared at the text. Thought about the kitchen in Celine's apartment, the coffee, the crack they'd opened in something sealed, the fact that cracks spread. Yes, she typed back. Bring food. I haven't eaten. Celine arrived at 10 with pastries from the bakery 3 blocks over, which was the bakery from their childhood neighborhood, which meant Celine had driven 40 minutes out of her way, which meant this mattered in a specific and weighted way. Mara noticed this and did not comment on it. They sat on the floor of Mara's living room, not at the table, not on the couch, on the floor with the pastry box between them, which was something they had done as children in the house they'd grown up in when things were serious. Sitting on the floor of whoever's bedroom felt safer. Neither of them acknowledged that this was what they were doing. They both knew it. Celine picked at a pastry and didn't eat it. I've been thinking, Celine said, about why I do it. Do what? The things you said. In my kitchen. She looked at the floor. The jokes. The diminishing. I've been trying to figure out if I knew what I was doing. And I think I knew something, Celine said slowly. I knew that you were always the one who felt things, who was careful about things, who paid attention. She paused. And I think some part of me, a long time ago, decided that if I made you smaller, I was bigger. And Her voice changed, went rough in a way that Celine's voice almost never went rough, because Celine's voice was always managed. I'm ashamed of that. I'm genuinely ashamed of it. The houseplant sat on the windowsill in the morning light. 6 years of surviving. I know, Mara said. You don't have to forgive me. I know that too. I'm also... Celine stopped, picked up the pastry, put it down. I'm also scared of this thing with you and Adrian, and I need to be honest about why. It's not about him. It's not about his family, or whether you fit, or any of that. She finally looked at Mara directly. It's because if you get this, If you actually get someone who sees you the way he apparently sees you, then I have to ask why I've been settling, what I've been doing with my own life while I was busy managing yours." The room was quiet. "I've been engaged for 2 years," Celine said, "and I don't know if I love Marcus the way—" She stopped, shook her head. "I don't know if I love him the right way. And watching you these past weeks, watching you be alive again, watching you take up space, it terrified me. Because it meant the problem wasn't that love like that doesn't exist. It meant the problem was mine." Mara looked at her sister, her glamorous, effortless, carefully armored sister, sitting cross-legged on her floor in the morning light, looking like a 29-year-old woman who is very tired of the version of herself she's been performing. "Celine," she said, "don't be nice to me. I don't deserve—" "Celine!" Mara reached across the pastry box and put her hand on her sister's knee. "I'm not being nice. I'm being accurate. You came here. That matters." She waited until Celine looked at her. "And the thing about the engagement, that's a conversation you need to have with Marcus, but not today. Today you just told me the true thing. That's enough for today." Celine pressed her lips together, nodded, picked up her pastry, and this time actually ate some of it. They sat on the floor for another hour. The conversation moved and shifted and found easier ground, and then came back to harder ground and moved again, the way sisters talk when they finally stopped performing for each other. Messy, circular, punctuated by silences that didn't need to be filled. When Celine left, she hugged Mara in the doorway with the particular fierceness of someone who has been trying to figure out for a long time how to reach across a distance they helped create. Mara stood in her doorway after the elevator doors closed and felt the strange compound emotion of a day that had rearranged itself into something she hadn't anticipated. Not simpler, not resolved, but true in a way that things hadn't been true in a long time. Her phone buzzed. "Adrian, are you free tonight? My mother called me this morning." She stared at the screen. "What did she say?" "She wants to have dinner. She wants us both there." She said, a pause, the typing indicator appearing and disappearing twice before the message came through. "She said she has something she owes you both." Mara read it twice. Her heartbeat was doing something specific in her chest. Not panic, not the racing dread of the parking garage or the elevator. Something different, something that moved like anticipation moves, with its mixture of longing and terror and the specific vertigo of standing at the edge of something large and not yet knowing whether it will hold you. She typed back, "What time?" "7. Is that—" "7," she confirmed, before he could ask the question at the end of the sentence, before he could ask if she was sure, if she was ready, if this was too much. She was not sure. She was not ready. It was too much, and also it was exactly the right amount, and she was going anyway, which was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. She put her phone down on the counter and looked at her apartment. Her books, her old houseplant, the coffee ring on her desk, the burgundy dress hanging on the back of her bedroom door where she'd put it this morning after she'd taken it off, still vivid in the gray light, still exactly what it was. She thought about Vivian on that pavement, 4 seconds in the cold, the car keys in her hand. She thought about what it cost to live inside the wrong belief for 30 years, the interest it collects. She was not going to pay that bill. She had decided that somewhere between the bridal boutique and the parking garage and the kitchen conversation with Celine and the dinner last night and this morning on her floor, she had decided, in pieces and then all at once, that she was done paying for a belief that had never been hers to begin with. 7 o'clock. Vivian's house. Whatever came next. She straightened up, went to make more coffee, stood at her kitchen counter in the Saturday morning light and felt, moving underneath the nervousness and the rawness and the complicated residue of an enormous week, something that was almost unrecognizable because it had been gone so long. Steadiness. Not the performed kind, not the practiced calm of a woman who has learned to look fine from the outside. The real kind. The kind that comes from the inside of a person who has finally, at 28 years old, after decades of making herself smaller to survive, decided to take up exactly the space she was always supposed to occupy. The coffee maker beeped. She poured her cup and looked out the window at the city in the morning. And somewhere across that city, in a study lined with leather-bound books and old oil paintings, a woman sat at her desk with a photograph on the surface in front of her and picked up her phone and began, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been wrong and knows it, and is choosing, late but not too late, to be accurate. To write a message to her son that started with the two most difficult words in any language: I'm sorry. The Kestrel house was quieter than Mara had imagined it. She had built it up in her mind over the weeks, not consciously, but the way you build things in the dark, when you have enough information to be afraid. She had imagined something imposing, something that announced its own significance from the street the way certain buildings do, all sharp angles and deliberate grandeur. What she found, when Adrian's car turned onto the residential street just past 7 and pulled up to the curb, was a house that was simply large and old and well-kept. The kind of house that had been a home long enough that it had stopped trying to be anything else. Brick facade, tall windows with the lights on inside casting long rectangles of amber onto the front walk. A garden in its late autumn state. Stripped back, patient, waiting. She sat in the passenger seat for a moment after Adrian turned off the engine. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." They walked up the front path, and he did not reach for her hand, and she did not reach for his. And this was right. They were arriving as two separate people who had chosen each other, not as a unit performing togetherness. And that distinction mattered in a way she couldn't have articulated 6 weeks ago, but understood now in her body. The door opened before they knocked. Vivian was the one who opened it, which Mara registered as significant. No housekeeper, no assistant, no buffer. She had come to the door herself. She was wearing dark trousers and a charcoal blouse and no jewelry except small pearl earrings, and she looked, in person on her own threshold, smaller than she had at Catherine Hollis's dinner. Not diminished, just human-scaled. A woman in her 60s in her own house on a Saturday evening, having made a decision that was costing her something. "Come in," she said. Her voice was level. Her eyes went to Mara first, briefly, and then to her son, and something moved in them that she pressed back before it could become visible. The entry hall was warm and smelled of food being cooked somewhere in the back of the house. Real food, not catered. Mara could smell garlic and something slow-braised and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been occupied for hours. This too was deliberate, she understood. This was Vivian saying, in the language she knew how to use, that this was not a performance, that she had cooked. They went into the sitting room. Not the formal dining room, not the study. The sitting room, with its two sofas facing each other across a low table and the fire already going in the grate, and 3 glasses of wine already poured and waiting. Vivian had arranged this carefully. It was an arrangement that said, "This is a conversation, not a tribunal." Mara sat. Adrian sat beside her, not pressed against her, just present. Vivian took the sofa across from them and picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. "I'm going to say some things," Vivian said, "and I'd like to say them without being interrupted. After that, you can say whatever you need to say." She looked at Adrian. "Both of you." "Okay," Adrian said. She looked at Mara. "I had a report prepared on you. Before we met. Before Catherine's dinner." She said it without softening it, without the apologetic preamble that would have made it easier to hear and less honest. Your employment history, your address, your family background, your sister's social profile. She paused. "I want you to know that because I'm not interested in you finding out later. I went looking for reasons to dismiss you before I'd spent 10 minutes in your presence. That was wrong. It was wrong in the specific way that powerful people are wrong when they treat other people as variables in a problem rather than as human beings." The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the late autumn wind pushed something across the garden. "I also," Vivian continued, her voice still precise but carrying something underneath it now, something with friction in it, the sound of a woman pushing through resistance. "I also called Catherine Hollis and had you invited to that dinner under circumstances designed to give me the advantage. You were on my ground, in a room with my people, at a table I knew. And you were there without full information about why." She looked at Mara directly. "I want to apologize for that." Mara held the woman's gaze. "And I want to apologize," Vivian said, and her voice changed on the second apology, went rougher, like something had given slightly in the mechanism of it, "to my son, for 34 years of treating your choices as assets to be managed, rather than a life to be lived." She looked at Adrian, and for the first time since Mara had seen her, Vivian Kestrel's face was not composed. It was not broken, not dramatically unguarded, but the composure had thinned to transparency, and underneath it was the face of a woman who had spent a very long time being right, and was now in the unfamiliar territory of being wrong, and choosing to stand in it rather than retreat. I told myself it was love. I told myself that every boundary I set, every criterion I held, everything I managed you away from was protection. And it was. It was protection, but it was also... She stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the fire. It was also cowardice, dressed up as strength. The room held that. Adrian was very still beside Mara. She could feel the quality of his stillness. Not shock, not anger, but the particular stillness of a person receiving something they have needed for a long time and are not sure yet how to carry. "I don't know how to do this differently," Vivian said, and this was the most unguarded thing. The thing that landed hardest because it was the truest. Not an excuse, not a request for forgiveness, just a statement of fact delivered by a woman who had built her entire life on competence and was now standing at the edge of a skill she had never developed. "I don't know how to be a mother rather than a director. I'm telling you that because I'm 61 years old, and I'm tired of pretending that the things I don't know how to do are actually things I've chosen not to do." Adrian made a sound. Just a sound. Not words, not yet. The involuntary audible quality of something releasing in the chest. "You don't have to know how," Mara said. Both of them looked at her. She hadn't planned to speak yet, but the words were accurate, and she had decided some time ago to lead with accuracy. "You don't have to know how to do it differently before you start. You just have to be willing to do it badly for a while before you do it better." She held Vivian's gaze. "That's what I've been doing my whole life with other people. Being willing to be bad at it first." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across her face. "You're not what I expected," Vivian said finally. "I know," Mara said. "You're not what I expected either." Something shifted in Vivian's expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the architecture of one. The possible shape of it. Adrian put his wine glass down on the table. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at his mother with an expression that had taken 34 years to arrive at and was finally here. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was quiet and direct. "The Marcus Veal letter. I should have told you I'd read it 4 years ago instead of holding it over tonight's conversation. That wasn't fair." Vivian's jaw tightened, released. "No," she said, "it wasn't. I used it because I was angry, and I needed something to break through." He held her gaze. "I'm not sorry I said it. I'm sorry I weaponized it." A long silence. "His name was Marcus," Vivian said, and she said it quietly, in the way of someone handling something they've kept in a drawer for decades and are now, finally, picking up in the light. He wanted to move to Portugal. He had this idea about architecture, about sustainable building, about the kind of work that didn't... She stopped. "He was very good. Not rich. Very good." She looked at the fire. "My mother told me the family couldn't sustain a match like that, that the business needed a different kind of alliance, that love was..." She paused, and the pause had the texture of an old pane that has been pressed so flat by time it has become part of the floor. She used the word indulgent. Love was indulgent. The fire. The garden wind. "I wrote him a letter," Vivian said, "ending it. I spent 3 weeks writing it. I threw away 11 drafts. The final version was a paragraph. Very clean. Very precise." She said the word with the specific self-knowledge of someone who has identified her own weapon. "He sent one back. Your father found it before I did. He gave it to me without opening it. He never asked what it said." She looked at her son. "Your father was a good man in the ways that mattered for the kind of life we built. He was not a good man in the ways that would have made that life feel like something more than architecture." Adrian was very still. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me," Vivian said with a return of the precision, but softer now, worn at the edges. "I'm telling you because you asked me once how I could believe that feelings were temporary. And the answer is that I spent 30 years making them be. And the cost of that..." She looked at Mara, and this look was different from all the previous looks. Had something in it that was not evaluation or appraisal or examination, but something closer to honest recognition. The cost of that is sitting across from a woman my son loves and knowing that I almost did the same thing to him that was done to me, for the same reason, and calling it by the same name. This something saints. The word sat in the room. Loves. Mara felt it move through her. She did not look at Adrian. She was not ready to look at him yet. She kept her eyes on Vivian and breathed and felt the words settle into a place in her chest that had been waiting for exactly that wait. Mrs. Kestrel, she said. Her voice was steady, and she was glad of it, and also she understood that the steadiness was real now, not performed, not the surgical absence of tears she'd developed at 11 years old. Real. Hers. I'm not going to pretend the last several weeks have been easy. I'm not going to tell you the report didn't matter, or the dinner didn't matter, or that any of it was fine. She held the woman's gaze. But I'm also not interested in carrying it forward. I'm 28 years old and I have spent too much of my life carrying things that belong to other people. I'm setting yours down right here. She paused. What we do from here is what matters. Vivian set down her wine glass. She straightened slightly, the unconscious adjustment of a woman realigning herself to a new position, and there was something in the gesture that was, if you knew how to read her, the closest thing to relief she knew how to express. All right, Vivian said, then let's have dinner. The kitchen was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of a room that had actually been cooked in. Pots on the stove, a wooden spoon balanced across the edge of a pan, the kind of organized disorder that means someone has been working in this space for hours. Vivian had made a slow-braised short rib, which Mara would learn later was a dish her mother-in-law had taught her, and which she had not made since the early years of her marriage, when she'd still been learning what kind of woman she was going to be in this house. She had made it tonight without explaining why. She didn't need to explain it. The cooking was the explanation. They ate at the kitchen table, not the dining room. Adrian opened a second bottle of wine. Vivian asked Mara about the East Side Community Center. Not the abstract policy question she'd asked at Catherine's dinner, but the specific ground-level question of who it served, what programs it ran, what it would lose if it moved. Mara answered. Vivian listened with the focused quality Mara had seen at dinner, but with the defensiveness drained out of it. Just a sharp woman with a sharp mind paying attention to something she'd previously decided wasn't worth her attention, and finding that she'd been wrong about its dimensions. Adrian watched his mother ask questions and actually listened to the answers, and felt something he would have been unable to name with any precision. Not relief exactly, not vindication, but something that had been a wound for a very long time doing something wounds do when they finally get the right conditions, starting, slowly and without drama, to close. After dinner, while Mara was carrying plates to the counter, she'd simply stood up and started carrying, which was the kind of automatic helpfulness she'd always had, that she'd learned to suppress in unfamiliar houses, and was choosing tonight not to suppress. Vivian stood beside her at the sink and said quietly, without looking at her, "He smiles differently since you." Mara turned on the tap. Warm water. "How did he smile before?" "Correctly," Vivian said. "He smiled when it was appropriate. Never when it wasn't. Never when he forgot to decide to." She handed Mara a dish. "He forgot to decide the other night, at Catherine's, when you said something about compound interest and then clearly realized you hadn't meant it as a joke and slightly regretted it." A pause. "He laughed before he'd decided to. I hadn't seen that since he was 8. Mara held the dish and looked at the running water. "He deserves that," she said. "Yes," Vivian said, "he does." And they did the dishes, which was not something Mara had anticipated doing in the Kestrel house on a Saturday night, and the doing of them had a normalizing effect that no amount of careful conversation could have manufactured. The ordinary shared physicality of washing and drying and putting away, navigating a kitchen that wasn't hers, asking where the glasses went, the small coordination of two people working in a shared space, it was real in a way that dinner party conversations couldn't quite be, and by the time they were done, the room had a different quality. Not warmth exactly, not yet, not the easy warmth of long familiarity, but the beginning of something that could become that, with time and honesty and the willingness to be bad at it first. They left at 10. Vivian stood in the doorway and said goodnight and did not hug Mara, which was right. A hug would have been too much, would have been a performance of closeness that hadn't been earned yet. What she did was look at Mara with those precise, thorough eyes and say simply, "Next week, if you're both available." A dinner. An invitation, not a summons. The first one that had been genuinely both. "We're available," Mara said. On the drive home, she and Adrian were quiet for a long time. The city had gone into its late-night configuration. Fewer cars, the streets lit but emptier. The particular quality of a city that has been awake all day and is now half dreaming. Mara watched it pass the window and felt the weight of the evening settling in her, layer by layer, the way things settle after a long storm. "Are you okay?" Adrian said, eventually. She thought about it, actually thought about it, rather than reaching for the automatic response. "I'm a lot of things," she said. "I'm tired. I'm something that might be relieved. I'm not sure yet. She paused. "I feel like I've been bracing for a collision for a long time, and the collision happened and I'm still upright. I don't quite know what to do with that yet." He nodded. "Yeah." "She said something," Mara said, "when we were doing the dishes." "I know," he said. "I heard from the other room." She looked at him, his profile in the passing streetlights. "He smiles differently," she said. "She's right," he said. "I do." She looked back at the window. A block passed. 2. "Adrian," she said. "Yeah." "I'm not going anywhere." She said it plainly, without preamble. "I want you to know that. Not because everything is fixed, it's not. Not because it's easy, it isn't. But because I've spent my whole life finding reasons to leave before someone else could, finding the fault lines and using them as exits." She watched the street. "I'm not doing that here." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, and then quieter. "I'm not either." They pulled up to her building. He stopped the car. She didn't get out immediately. The heater was running and the engine ticked quietly, and outside the city did its patient thing. "The building," she said, "the east side one, with the community center plan." "What about it?" "You should tell the board next week, before you lose your nerve." He turned and looked at her. "I won't lose my nerve," he said. "I know, tell them anyway." He held her gaze for a moment. Then slowly, the thing his mother had described, the unscheduled smile, the one that arrived before the decision to arrive, moved across his face. "Good night, Mara," he said. "Good night," she said, and got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and watched the car pull away, and she stood there for a moment after its taillights had rounded the corner and disappeared, standing on the ordinary sidewalk in front of her ordinary building in the cold autumn air, and she breathed. In. Out. Not counting it, not managing it, just breathing, because she was alive and the night was cold and she was still here. She went inside. Months moved the way months do when you're building something rather than just surviving. Not quickly, but fully, each one containing more than the last. The community center negotiation went to the board in November and was, as predicted, challenged, and Adrian held his position through 3 meetings with the particular stubbornness of a man who has recently remembered what it feels like to care about something he hasn't been told to care about. And the project was restructured with the community space integrated on the ground floor. And when the approval finally came through, he called Mara from the conference room before he called anyone else. Celine ended her engagement in December. It was not dramatic. No scene, no explosion, just a quiet conversation with Marcus on a Tuesday evening that ended with both of them understanding something they'd been avoiding for 2 years. Marcus, to his credit and to Celine's genuine surprise, said he'd been waiting for her to say it, that he'd known. The way you know things about a person when you've been with them long enough to see their face when they're not performing. They parted without cruelty, which Celine had feared would be impossible and discovered was not. And afterward she called Mara, and they talked for 2 hours, and Celine cried in the specific way of someone releasing grief that is not for what they've lost, but for how long they've been pretending they hadn't already lost it. She started therapy in January. She chose a therapist herself, found them herself, made the appointment without telling anyone first. She mentioned it to Mara a week later, casually, over coffee, as a fact rather than a confession. Mara said, "Good. Just that. One word, no fuss, No performance of how important this was. And Celine looked at her across the table and understood that this was what it felt like to be received as a whole person rather than a role, and that she wanted more of it, from more people, and would have to become more of one in order to get it. Vivian's Tuesday dinners became a fixture. Not every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, sometimes a gap of 3 when schedules compressed. But they became a thing that existed, a recurring item in multiple calendars, and with each one the room became incrementally easier, the conversation incrementally more real. Vivian asked questions about Mara's work and remembered the answers and referenced them in later conversations, which was the way Vivian showed interest. Not effusively, not with warmth that didn't yet come naturally, but with the attention and retention of someone who has decided that a person matters. For Mara, that was enough. That was in some ways everything. She brought her grandmother to one of those dinners in February. Josephine Ellsworth was 73 years old and had the particular quality of someone who has seen enough of the world to be neither impressed nor dismissive of any version of it. And she sat at Vivian's kitchen table and ate the slow-braised lamb that Vivian was now making regularly and said to Vivian, with the directness of someone who had earned the right to it over 7 decades, "You nearly missed this, you know." Vivian looked at her. "I know." "And you didn't." Josephine picked up her wine glass. "That matters more than the nearly." Vivian looked at Mara across the table. Mara was talking to Adrian about something. The board meeting, probably, or the community center construction schedule, or any of the dozen things they talked about as naturally now as breathing. And she was animated in the way she was animated when she was arguing a point she cared about. Chin slightly forward, hands doing that thing where they moved without her monitoring them. Her face unguarded in the specific way that only happened when she felt safe enough not to watch it. "Yes," Vivian said quietly to Josephine. "It does." The bridal boutique was on a Thursday in March. Mara went alone. This was important. She didn't bring Celine, didn't bring anyone. She parked on the street and walked in through the same glass door she'd walked through 6 months ago, and the carpet was the same and the lighting was the same, and Corinne, the sales associate, was not there that day, which was probably for the best. A different associate helped her. Young woman, early 20s, professional and unhurried. She asked Mara what she had in mind, and Mara said, "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, something that's actually mine." The associate looked at her for a moment and then said, "Okay, let's start with silhouettes." They went through several dresses. Mara tried them methodically, without ceremony, looking at each one in the mirror with the specific attention of someone who has learned to see themselves clearly and is not afraid of what they see. Not uncritically. She had preferences, things that worked and things that didn't, and she said so directly and without apology. But not fearfully either. The body in the mirror was hers. She had made a kind of peace with it that was not complacency and not performance, but something more like citizenship. The understanding that this is the country you live in, that you might as well know its geography. The fourth dress was ivory silk. She stood in front of the mirror in it, and the associate asked if she wanted to check the back, and Mara said yes, and the associate carefully drew the zipper up, and it moved, smoothly, without drama, without resistance, all the way to the top, and there was nothing extraordinary about this except that 6 months ago it would have destroyed her, and today it was just a zipper doing its job, and that difference contained something she didn't have a word for but felt precisely in her sternum. Nothing had changed about her body. That was the point. The same body, the same zipper. The different thing was the woman inside it. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The silk caught the boutique's warm light and held it. The neckline was right. The waist fell where it was supposed to. She looked, for the first time that she could recall, exactly like herself. "Yes," she said. "This one." The wedding was in June. Late afternoon, outdoor venue. One of those clear summer evenings that feel like an agreement between the city and the sky to behave beautifully for a specific occasion. They had kept it to people who mattered. No extended social performance, no network maintenance disguised as celebration. About 60 people who actually knew them. Josephine was in the front row and watched her granddaughter walk down an aisle without shrinking, without the practiced smile, without the slight inward curve of shoulders that had been Mara's posture for most of her adult life. She walked straight. She walked like a woman who has somewhere specific to be and is choosing to be there. Celine stood at the left side of the altar, her sister's only attendant. She had cut her hair in April, shorter than she'd worn it since childhood, a decision she'd made one afternoon without consultation, and which suited her in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a choice that was entirely hers. She watched Mara walk and felt the particular joy that is not competitive and not comparative and not measured against anyone else's happiness. The clean, uncommon joy of wanting something for another person simply because they deserve it, because you love them, because their good fortune expands rather than diminishes your own. Adrian stood at the end of the aisle and watched Mara come toward him. He had told her the previous evening that he was not going to be able to describe how he felt in that moment, that he'd tried, and all the words felt like approximations. She'd told him approximations were fine, that the gesture of trying was the thing. He had not been able to prepare for the actual sight of her. He thought he had, thought he'd imagined it enough times to be ready, and found that imagination had done nothing useful at all. She was wearing the ivory silk dress and her grandmother's earrings, and she was walking toward him with her shoulders level and her face fully open, not guarded, not performed. And she was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has chosen something clearly and is at peace with the choosing. He felt his eyes go. He had not planned for this either. He had, at 17, cried in a car and been told this made him weak. He stood at an altar at 34, in front of 60 people, and let his eyes go because he had learned, slowly, at real cost, through the specific education of loving someone who refuses to let you be less than you are, that the things that move through you are not weakness. They are proof. She reached him. She looked at his face, at his bright eyes, at the jaw that had been through arguments and won, at the unscheduled smile that had arrived and not bothered to ask permission. And she felt, moving through her like a current, something that she understood completely for the first time in her life. Not relief that she had been chosen. Not gratitude that someone had finally seen her, something older and more fundamental than either of those. She had chosen herself first, and from that, everything else had followed. She took his hands. They were warm. His hands were always warm. The officiant said whatever officiants say, the words that mark the shape of the occasion, and both of them said the things you say in return, and meant them, with the specific weight of two people who have come a long distance to be standing in this particular light, saying these particular words to each other. When it was over, the evening doing its amber gold work across the venue, the 60 people moving around them in the loose choreography of a celebration that has been genuinely earned, Mara stood with her grandmother near the edge of the garden. Josephine held her hand, did not say anything for a while. Then, "You know what I was watching today?" "What?" Mara said. "The way you walked." She squeezed her hand. "I have watched you walk into rooms your whole life and apologize with your posture for being in them. Today you walked like you paid for the room and threw away the receipt." Mara looked at her grandmother's profile, the 73 years in it, the patience. "I had help," Mara said. "You did the work," Josephine said. "Other people were present. You did the work." Across the venue, Celine was laughing at something. Real laughter, the unguarded kind, head tilted back, talking with a woman from the nonprofit where Mara worked, a woman she'd never met before today and had apparently found an immediate and genuine connection with. And watching her sister laugh like that, without calculation, without performance, without the ambient competition that had lived in their sisterhood for 20 years, Mara felt something complete itself, not fixed, not repaired to its original condition, the way things that break are sometimes said to be as good as new, which is never true. More like the Japanese practice she'd read about once, broken things repaired with gold, the cracks made visible, the history of the breaking honored rather than hidden. The thing was whole. The cracks were still there. The cracks were now part of it. Adrian found her sometime later, coming back from a conversation with his mother. He came to stand beside her without announcement, which was his way. Just arriving, being there. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. "She's talking to your boss," he said. "Vivian and Gerald?" "Vivian and Gerald about urban infrastructure." He paused. "Gerald looks very happy." Gerald always looks happy when someone will talk about infrastructure. She's been talking to him for 20 minutes. Mara looked across the venue, found the two figures, Gerald animated, gesturing, doing the thing he did when he was engaged, and Vivian with that focused listening quality that was, Mara had come to understand, her version of warmth. The closest she could get to it with people she was still learning, getting closer. "She's trying," Mara said. "Yeah," Adrian said, "she is." The evening continued, as evenings do, in its own time. The light changed by degrees from amber to gold to the soft blue that comes after, that particular color of a summer evening winding down. And the 60 people began the gradual dispersal of a celebration that has done what it came to do. Mara stood in it, stood in the middle of the evening with the ivory silk dress and her grandmother's earrings and the gold ring that had been put on her finger an hour ago, and she felt the fullness of it. Not happiness exactly, which is too simple a word for anything that costs what this had cost, but something larger and more durable than happiness. Something earned. She thought about the bridal boutique 6 months ago. The zipper, the mirrors, the practiced smile she'd installed while a dress refused to close. She thought about the elevator in the department store, the parking garage, the cold concrete, his hand over hers. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into apologizing for her own presence, all the space she'd refused to occupy, all the years she'd spent being a rough draft of herself, waiting for someone to tell her the revision was worth making. She had not needed anyone to tell her. That was the thing she understood now, standing in the late blue light of her own wedding, that she had not needed anyone to tell her. She had needed time and honesty and the willingness to be bad at it first, and a man who stayed on cold concrete and held her hand until the storm passed, and a sister who finally came through a door that had been shut too long, and a grandmother who had been waiting, patient and certain, for Mara to arrive at something that had always been true. She had needed all of those things, and none of them was the source of the change. They were the conditions. The change itself had been hers. She had done the work. She was still doing it. She would always be doing it, in the small daily way that change requires, one morning at a time, one room at a time, one choice not to make herself smaller at a time. But tonight, standing in the golden blue end of this particular day, she was not thinking about the work that remained. She was standing in what the work had built, feeling the weight of her own life in her own hands, and finding it not light, not easy, not uncomplicated, but entirely, exactly hers. She looked up at the sky, which was doing something spectacular in the way summer skies do without needing an occasion. The first stars becoming visible in the east, the last light still holding in the west, the city below and around, and the 60 people dispersing slowly into the evening, and Adrian somewhere behind her moving toward her through the crowd. She could feel it before she heard his footsteps. She did not turn around yet. She stayed in the moment a breath longer, felt its edges. Let it be exactly what it was, neither more nor less, neither inflated into symbol nor diminished into sentiment. Then she turned. He was there. He was always, she was learning, just there. She held out her hand. He took it.